What if, overnight, everything you loved was taken from you? Your job, your health, your family, no explanation, no warning, and worst of all, no word from heaven. Would you still believe? Would you still worship? This isn't just a question from an ancient book. It's a question that haunts the soul of every believer. The story of Job isn't a fairy tale. It's a brutal, beautiful confrontation with faith stripped bare. He wasn't tested because he was weak. He was tested because he was strong. And what happened next shook heaven and hell alike. But here's the truth. No one tells you. You don't really know what kind of faith you have until everything else is gone. This video isn't about Job. It's about you, because your trial might look different, but the question is the same. Do you love God or just His blessings? And when the blessings disappear, what's left? In the next few minutes, we'll walk through the ashes, the silence, the pain, and maybe, just maybe, discover a kind of faith that the enemy can't touch. If you had met Job in his time, you'd see a man the whole city admired. Wealthy, yes, but more than that, he was respected for his character. He was a man of integrity, a man who feared God deeply and turned away from evil instinctively. His righteousness wasn't performative. It flowed from who he was at the core. His reputation wasn't built on money, but on his unwavering devotion. In a world filled with noise, Job walked in silent reverence. Job wasn't just rich in gold, he was rich in love. He had 10 children, a harmonious household, and land overflowing with prosperity. But what stood out most wasn't his abundance, it was his gratitude. He offered sacrifices not just for himself, but for his children's possible sins, even unknown ones. That reveals a man more concerned with their souls than their success. Job feared not punishment, but separation from the holy. People often say, God blesses the good. And in Job's early life, that appeared true. He was the living example of divine favor, a life where faith and blessing seem to walk hand in hand. But it's easy to trust when the skies are clear and harvests are full. Job's story, however, wasn't just about the blessings, it was about what remained when they were stripped away. That's where the true depth of his faith would be revealed. Job's reverence wasn't transactional. It wasn't, I'll serve you if you bless me. It was relational. His heart beat with loyalty to a God he trusted without needing to understand everything. He didn't need daily signs or constant reassurance. He just walked with God, one day at a time, believing that the Creator's wisdom was greater than his comprehension. That kind of faith is rare, and it's exactly what made him a target, because behind the scenes, something cosmic was about to unfold. In the heavenly courts, Job's name came up, not because he failed, but because he stood firm. He was about to become the battlefield where the question of true faith would be tested. Would a man love God even without the blessings? Would he cling to the divine when everything else was taken? Heaven watched, hell plotted. Job had no idea his life was a spiritual proving ground. This isn't just ancient history, it's a mirror. Because at some point, every believer becomes Job. You may not have camels or cattle, but you have something that matters. A job, a family, a dream, a calling. And when those things tremble, we discover what our faith was really built on. Was it comfort or was it communion? That's why Job's story has echoed through time, because it's our story too. And here's the real question. If you were Job, would your story begin the same way? Would your reputation for faith be known not just by neighbors, but in heaven itself? Would God speak your name as a model of trust? Or would comfort be your condition for belief? These questions don't accuse, they awaken. And what happens next in Job's story? It's where faith stops being safe and starts being sacred. The book of Job takes a sharp turn, not on earth, but in heaven. In a mysterious scene, God holds court with celestial beings, and among them appears Satan, the accuser. God himself brings up Job, Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one like him. These words weren't just praise, they were a declaration. Job's life was a living testimony of faith, but the enemy wasn't impressed. He was suspicious. Satan throws down a challenge, one soaked in accusation. Does Job fear God for nothing? In other words, he only loves you because you bless him. It wasn't just a shot at Job, but at the very nature of faith. The enemy was questioning whether true devotion could exist without reward. And it's a question many people still wrestle with today. Is your faith genuine, or is it a deal? God responds with both confidence and permission. Everything he has is in your power, but don't touch his life. That moment set off a chain reaction of loss, pain, and spiritual warfare. Job never saw coming. The man who once lived in peace would now walk through the storm, not because he failed, but because he was chosen. That's something we often forget. Sometimes the battle comes because of your strength, not your weakness. Job didn't know his life had become the stage for a cosmic test. He wasn't being punished. He was being proven. In the silence between heaven's permission and earth's devastation, Job stood unaware. But God wasn't. He believed in Job. He trusted that even without the blessings, Job's heart would still burn with loyalty, and that kind of trust from God, it's both an honor and a heavy burden. We often picture trials as punishment, but what if they're invitations? What if your suffering is the backdrop for a divine testimony? In Job's case, the challenge was clear. Strip him of everything and see what remains. No wealth, no children, no health, just raw faith, the kind that doesn't need a reason to worship, the kind that loves even in the dark. That's what the enemy couldn't understand. And maybe that's what we're called to learn too. That faith is not a formula. It's a fire. It either burns brighter in loss or it disappears when the winds blow. Satan wanted to extinguish Job's devotion, but God wanted the world to see real faith endures. Not because it's easy, but because it's anchored in someone eternal. In Job's test, we begin to see the deeper meaning of trust. But the test hadn't even begun. The permission was granted, the stage was set, and the first wave of destruction was on its way. Job was about to lose more than he ever imagined. And the question still lingers like thunder in the distance. When the storm hits, will faith survive? In a single day, Job's world unraveled. Servants came one after another, each bearing devastating news. First, his oxen and donkeys were stolen. Then, fire from heaven consumed his sheep. Raiders took his camels. And finally, the most crushing blow, his children were all killed in a sudden windstorm. 10 lives, gone in a breath. Everything he loved turned to ash. We read these verses quickly, but stop and imagine the weight. Job didn't lose a wallet, he lost his legacy. Not one child, but all of them. Not over years, but in a day. How does a man even breathe after news like that? He didn't scream, curse, or collapse into bitterness. Instead, he tore his robe, shaved his head, and fell to the ground in worship. That's not weakness. That's the power of broken surrender. Then Job spoke one of the most haunting, powerful lines in all of Scripture. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. These words don't come from comfort. They come from a soul anchored beyond the visible. Job wasn't celebrating, he was choosing to bless even in the dark. That kind of praise shakes the gates of hell, because it can't be bought. Pain didn't blind Job's faith, it revealed it. His first response wasn't revenge, blame, or bitterness. It was reverence. He grieved, but he didn't curse. He questioned nothing yet. Instead, he anchored his heart in the eternal nature of God. And that's something we're rarely taught, that worship in tragedy is more powerful than 1,000 sermons. It's proof that God is still enough, but the test wasn't over. Job had passed the first wave, but Satan wasn't done. With God's permission, he struck again. This time, Job's body was covered with painful boils from head to toe. The man who once walked in abundance now sat in ashes, scraping his wounds with broken pottery. His skin burned, his soul ached, and the only thing louder than the silence was his suffering. Still, he did not sin with his lips. Imagine sitting alone, your name cursed, your body destroyed, your life in ruins, and still lifting your eyes to heaven. That's not natural strength, that's divine dependence. Job had nothing left to hold on to except the God he refused to let go of. In that moment, Job wasn't just a man, he was a monument of faith, a silent sermon to generations. And yet, even as he sat in the dust, unshaken in faith, the real storm was just beginning, not around him, but within him. Because sometimes the heaviest collapse isn't the loss of things, it's the wrestling of the soul. What happens when your faith stands strong, but your heart starts to break? The silence of God can be louder than thunder, and in Job's case, it echoed through his soul like an unanswered prayer. After the ashes settled and the pain lingered, Job began to ask, not out of rebellion, but out of confusion. He didn't accuse God, but he couldn't ignore the ache inside. Why became the drumbeat of his soul. Why the suffering? Why the silence? Why the test? Job didn't lose his faith, but he started to feel the weight of it. Faith without answers can feel like walking in the dark with your eyes wide open. His friends arrived, not with comfort, but with accusations. They claimed his suffering must be punishment for sin. Even his own wife said, "Curse God and die." Imagine hearing that from the one who once stood beside you. Isolation cuts deeper than disease. But Job didn't curse. He wrestled, and that's different. He cried out in anguish, wishing he had never been born. He begged for clarity, for relief, for understanding. His prayers weren't polished, they were raw. He spoke with trembling lips and a shattered heart. Yet even in the questions, he spoke to God, not away from him. That alone says everything. Sometimes we forget that God welcomes our questions. He's not intimidated by our confusion or offended by our grief. Job's cries weren't a failure of faith, they were evidence of it. Only someone who still believes dares to speak to heaven in the storm. And Job's words were messy, poetic, tormented, and holy. They gave voice to the tension between hope and heartbreak. The longer the silence lasted, the more Job searched his soul. Was he being punished? Was God still with him? The human heart aches for reassurance in the dark, but the heavens remained still. And that's where many believers begin to drift, not because of anger, but because of absence. When it feels like God is silent, we start to wonder if he's even near. Job was no different. And yet, even surrounded by betrayal, disease, and despair, Job never let go. He questioned, yes, but never abandoned his belief. He challenged God, but never denied him. His inner conflict wasn't rooted in unbelief. It was born from a deep longing to understand the God he loved. That kind of honesty is sacred. It's not doubt that destroys faith. It's pretending we don't have any. And just when it seemed his questions would break him, something deeper began to emerge. Not answers, but awareness. A shift, a trembling stillness in his spirit. He had lost everything outside of him, and now even his certainty was gone. Yet somehow, what remained was more real than ever before. What was it? That's what we'll discover next. Before we continue, I want to pause for a moment and hear from you. Job's story forces us to ask ourselves one of the hardest questions of faith. Would you still trust God if everything was taken away? Not in theory, but in real life, right now. So tell me in the comments, what's the hardest test your faith has ever faced? Your testimony might encourage someone who's silently struggling right now. Let's build a space of honesty and hope together, right here in the comments. In the heart of suffering, Job made a declaration that silenced the darkness. Though he slay me, yet will I trust him. These weren't the words of a man who understood everything. They were the cry of a soul who chose trust over clarity. Job didn't get answers, explanations, or relief. What he got was the chance to respond, not with logic, but with loyalty. Faith, in its purest form, isn't certainty. It's surrender. Job's worship wasn't because he felt good. It was because he knew God was still good. That kind of faith can't be taught in comfort. It's born in fire. He wasn't clinging to hope for restoration anymore. He was clinging to the character of God, not what God could give, but who God is. And that shift is everything. That's when faith becomes more than belief. It becomes breath. Imagine trusting a God who won't explain himself, who lets you sit in silence, surrounded by ruins. That's not easy. That's not natural. But Job leaned into it. His response wasn't perfect, but it was pure. He wasn't performing for anyone. He was surviving on trust alone. And that trust became a light in his darkest hour. The kind of light that doesn't flicker in the wind. Job's friends kept talking, accusing, theologizing, but Job wasn't interested in religion. He wanted relationship. He didn't want doctrines about God. He wanted God himself. And that's what real faith does. It pushes past formulas and reaches for the face of the Father, even if that face is hidden for a time. Job's questions were deep, but his hunger for God was deeper. And then something profound began to shift. Job started to say things like, "I know that my Redeemer lives." He didn't say, "I hope" or "I wish." He said, "I know." That kind of knowing comes from the Spirit, not the senses. It's not built on circumstances, it's born in communion. Job couldn't see his Redeemer, but his heart recognized him. In that unseen place, faith stood tall. This response of faith wasn't loud, it was steady. It didn't demand, it trusted. And through it, Job found something the enemy never saw coming. Unshakable intimacy with God. That's what Satan underestimated. He thought removing the blessings would destroy Job's devotion, but in the end, it revealed the depth of it, a depth that even pain couldn't reach. And now we turn the question back to us. When your world collapses and God remains silent, what rises from your heart? Is it worship or withdrawal? Do you lean in or do you run? Because Job's story isn't just about ancient suffering. It's about a timeless choice. And as we'll see next, that choice now belongs to you. Now it's no longer about Job, it's about you. His story echoes through time, not to entertain, but to confront. Because whether you realize it or not, your faith is being tested too. Maybe not through boils or storms, but through silence, loss, disappointment. Maybe you're not sitting on ashes, but your soul feels scorched. And the question rises like smoke. Will you still believe? We love to quote scriptures about blessings. But what about when the blessings disappear? What about when the healing doesn't come? When the door stays shut? When the loved one isn't saved? That's when your theology collides with your reality. And that's when your faith is either revealed or replaced. Job's faith wasn't perfect, but it was persistent. Can the same be said of yours? This isn't meant to shame you, it's meant to awaken you. Because somewhere deep inside, your soul was made for this kind of faith, a faith that worships in the waiting, that loves without reward, that stands when everything else falls. It's not easy, but it's possible. Job did it. So can you, not because you're strong, but because the one you trust is. Maybe you're facing your own version of Job's trial right now, a betrayal, a diagnosis, a financial collapse, a deep loneliness, and the enemy whispers, "Where is your God now?" But like Job, you can choose to answer not with certainty, but with trust, not with understanding, but with surrender. That's where real strength lives, in the quiet faith that refuses to let go. And maybe, like Job, you're surrounded by voices that say, "Give up," but you don't have to. You can choose to rise, not with answers, but with alignment. You can choose to worship, even if your voice trembles. You can fall to your knees and still look up. Because sometimes, the greatest testimony isn't the miracle, it's the worship that comes before it. So let me ask you, would your faith survive if God said nothing? If the healing delayed, if the storm didn't pass, if the prayer wasn't answered the way you hoped, would you still say, "Blessed be the name of the Lord"? That's not just a question for Job, it's for you, right here, right now. The ashes may still be warm, the silence may still echo, but the decision is yours. And that decision opens a door, not just to endurance, but to encounter. Because what if, in the silence, God is drawing you closer? What if, in the fire, your faith is becoming gold? What if, in the very place you feel abandoned, you're being most deeply seen? We'll explore that in the next breath, but only if you're still listening with your spirit wide open. Job's story ends with restoration, but that's not the real victory. The real miracle wasn't what Job received, it was who he became. A man who worshipped in the dark, who trusted when God was silent, and who proved that faith isn't measured by comfort, but by commitment. And now, the question comes full circle to you. When life hurts and heaven is quiet, what will your soul say? Will you curse or will you cling? Because real faith isn't loud, it's loyal. It doesn't shout in the spotlight. It whispers, "I still believe," in the shadows. And that kind of faith changes everything, even when nothing changes. So I ask you now, where do you stand in your own test? Is your relationship with God built on trust or on transactions? Are you willing to keep walking even without answers? Because maybe, just maybe, the silence isn't absence, it's invitation. An invitation to go deeper, to become stronger, to see with the Spirit, not the eyes. If this message stirred something in you, don't keep it to yourself. Share your thoughts in the comments. What's your biggest takeaway from Job's story? Let us hear your heart, like the video if it spoke to you, and turn on notifications to keep discovering the deeper truths hidden in God's Word.